Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News, and I want to thank everybody for having me today on this panel. One of the things that we cover at Mint Press News is the concept of war and the driving factors and the special interests and the money interests that drive war today. And perhaps we talk a lot about war and cover war at Mint Press because of my personal experience living in a war zone and under Israeli occupation. I learned from a very, very young age that bombs are not dropped for humanitarian reasons. We don't drop bombs to save people. You see, I was born and raised in the pristine suburbs of Minneapolis, and when I was about 9 years old, my parents decided to move us back to their homeland, where they had come from, in Jerusalem. My parents are both Palestinian, and they really wanted us to learn more about our culture and heritage. And little did I know that this move would change my life forever. When we got onto the plane, or got off the plane, excuse me, and landed in Palestine, the first things that I noticed were just how clear and crisp the skies were and just how beautiful the landscape was. The people were so hospitable. You couldn't meet anybody without them inviting you into their home for tea. But it was really, really hard not to notice that we had just moved under Israeli occupation and apartheid. Immediately, we noticed in the streets roaming were soldiers aiming their guns at civilians. Israeli tanks were driving around to subdue and intimidate the Palestinian population. Within the first couple of years of moving there, it was quite peaceful, despite what I had just described as a police state. But then the Second Intifada had broken out. And when the Second Intifada had broken out, we had noticed that now checkpoints, armed checkpoints, were increasing across the whole country. And so going to school was obviously a lot more complicated for a lot of the students that were in my classroom. So now I was about in the 6th and 7th grade, and I would go to school a lot of the times with literally about half of the students missing from our class because they were being blocked and stopped at checkpoints. We would stay up at night sometimes and sit on the rooftop, and I don't know how my parents allowed us to do this, but when you live under a war zone, it kind of becomes normalized for you. But we'd sit on our rooftops at night as kids, and we'd actually watch Israeli airplanes drop bombs on the nearby town of Ramallah. Now that the Second Intifada had broken out and the occupation was expanding and life was becoming a lot more difficult, I noticed that people were starting to live in more fear than they were even before. And so now we would watch homes within our neighborhoods get demolished because Palestinians didn't have the right permits, you could say, for those homes, even though they literally had a lineage that could be dated back hundreds of years for them to have this land for them and their families. We would cross through checkpoints to visit family, which had become now a nightmare and a headache because they would just be jam-packed. People would try, elderly would be trying to go to the doctor, and Israeli soldiers would not allow them to pass through. Family members would try to visit each other, and if they didn't have the right sort of identification, they weren't allowed to pass through. And so life was really, really scary and intimidating under this Israeli occupation and apartheid. And so we would cross through checkpoints to visit family ourselves. And of course, we were lucky enough to hold American passports, so we would be able to pass through. But it was very eye-opening to see as American citizens just how other Palestinians, despite us being Palestinian, watching them get treated as second-class citizens. And so we would cross through checkpoints, and a lot of times our taxi driver would yell, "Duck," because Israeli soldiers would be shooting at young children who would be throwing rocks at them because they would be trying to cross through to get to school. Little 7- and 8-year-old kids holding their backpacks, holding their books, just trying to get through to go to school. And these soldiers were blocking them from getting through. Soon enough, our water was being cut off. Settlers were running loose, setting bombs in elementary schools. They were going to random homes in Jerusalem and taking fathers and sons, and mostly males, setting them on fire. And it soon became the place that we could no longer live in, especially because we were, let's face it, Americans, so we were used to a certain lifestyle. Despite, how we needed to connect with our culture there, it became very difficult. And so our parents then decided to move us back to the United States. And this was in 2001, in the beginning of the year. And when we had arrived back in the United States, we got off the plane once again, and it was almost like a new culture shock for myself, as now I was about 12 years old. All the trauma, all the experiences that I had left behind, I could not get them out of my head. That's all I could think about. And I had experienced what a lot of service members experience when they returned from war, which was survivor's guilt, PTSD, and anxiety. Life in Minnesota, in America, was so calm and so pristine. I mean, the lawns were so perfectly green. That's all I could remember seeing when we had arrived back into the States. When my mind was racing at 1,000 miles per hour, thinking only about the war that I had left behind. And so I assimilated back into school, now in about the 8th grade. And I felt very, very alone. I had suffered from really, really bad anxiety and PTSD. I remember sitting in my classroom, and students and teachers would try to ask me, like, hey, where are you from? You know, where'd you come from? All of these things. And I honestly would just utter the word Palestine, and tears would just keep dropping down my face. I could not talk about the war that I had left behind without just bawling to these people. And of course, these students were, 12 and 13-year-olds, and they had no idea what I had just left behind. They had no idea about the war that I had just left behind and had experienced. All they could think about, and all they were talking about, of course, were, sex, drugs, partying it up. So it was like a complete culture shock for me. And I felt so, so alone at the time. And so from there, at a very young age, I went to, to keep up with what was going on overseas and back home. Because all I could think about were the students in my class. Did they make it to school that day? Did my neighbor, was their water cut off? Were the kids allowed to go outside and play because of a curfew that was set by the state of Israel? And so that was really, really consuming me and kind of draining my energy, as you could say. And so I turned on my Fox News, my CNN, my MSNBC, all the media channels that you can think of, just to keep up to date with what was going on. And to my great surprise, the way the media covered this conflict was how they do, like any other conflict that we see covered today. It was covered through a religious lens. They painted it as like Muslim versus Jew. Muslims want to kill all the Jews and expel them, and all, just like crazy narratives that just were absolutely not true. Whenever they did show the conflict in Palestine, they only showed images of members of Hamas, militant imagery, men covered with their scarves, dark skin, kids wielding their weapons. And they painted Palestinians as a whole as if they were barbaric, uncivilized, and out to kill every Jew. And that's how they painted the conflict to the American public. And I was completely devastated at the time to have seen this and to see how the media had manipulated this narrative. And that was my first experience seeing how the media did mold and manipulate certain war narratives. And so I pointed to the media at the time and said, this is the reason why the kids in my class don't even know where Palestine is on a map. They think it's Pakistan. This is the reason why my neighbors and the people that are around me have no idea what was going on in our country back home. And so coincidentally, within the same year, September 11th happened. And so once again, I was sitting in my classroom. Now I was about 8th, 9th grade, and we had watched the Twin Towers getting hit by the airplanes. And immediately the conspiracies began to fly on the news that it was Muslims, it was Palestinians. And there I was again sitting there watching the media use Palestinians specifically as a means to dehumanize the Muslims overseas and Palestine in general. And so I was there watching, I can't remember if it was CNN or MSNBC, but one of those channels had actually planted a video in the media showing Palestinians in Gaza celebrating Eid, which is the holiday after Ramadan. And so I knew that Palestinians were not celebrating 9/11, because that's what they said, they're celebrating 9/11, not Eid, and they planted the story. And I was once again completely devastated. And I was sitting in my classroom when one of the kids had turned around and pointed at me and said, your people did this, your people did this. completely feeling alone at the time. And yet, once again, witnessing how the media was so manipulative in the way that they had painted an entire people in such a horrible light. And then, of course, we find out a couple days later that that news station had retracted that video and admitted that it was Palestinians celebrating Eid and not 9/11. But there I was, watching the media beat the drums of war once again. They were showing images of Muslim women in Afghanistan with their faces covered, with their bodies covered, being abused and neglected and not allowed to get an education, being abused by the Taliban. And so I did my own research to understand, well, what is this Islam that, you know, the media kept portraying? And soon enough, I understood that the media was using an imperialist version of Islam, Wahhabism, that was created by the United States and created by the British and pushed out by the United States and exported around the world to demonize and justify wars abroad. And so now we have the media pushing for another war. I had watched the media demonize Palestinians to justify the United States support of Israel at the tune of $4 billion per year. At the time it was around $3 billion, but now it's $4 billion. And now I was watching the media justify an invasion of Iraq, an invasion of Afghanistan that had left nearly 1 million people in both of those countries dead. And so right there and then, I pointed to the media and said, I have to become a part of the media to be able to change these narratives. And so I, at a very young age, found courage, I found catharsis, despite how alone I felt. And I looked at the media and I said, I am going to become part of the media to help change this narrative and represent Muslims, and especially Muslim women, because we were being told at the time that they're not intelligent, can't speak up for themselves, they're not independent, etc., etc. And so I wanted to stand up to these narratives and build bridges so that we can hopefully one day end war together. And so at a very young age, I decided I wanted to pursue journalism. And I did that, and I continued to do that throughout high school and then throughout college. I graduated with a degree in broadcast journalism in one of the top 10 broadcast journalism schools in the country at St. Cloud State University. And soon after, I worked for a local TV station and became the first American hijabi journalist in the United States. But that excitement for me was very short-lived, because next I landed an internship and job at a local NBC TV station with millions and millions of viewers watching that TV station. And I sat in the newsroom and heard the kinds of pitches that they were being made for the story of the day. And it just was so not important to me. It was so sensationalized. And I would sit there and pitch stories about, you know, how are we treating our veterans? How can we end war? I think all the other producers were looking at me like, okay, this girl's crazy. Like, we can't talk about these things on local media station. And so despite having such an amazing opportunity land in my lap, I actually looked around and said, I can't, you know, do this. Even though, sure, we might have hijabi on American television reporting these things, I'll just be reporting on the same thing that everybody else is reporting on and not actually making a difference, because they're not going to allow me to make a difference. They're not going to allow me to talk about the things that are really important about, you know, war and so forth. And so I actually immediately left the corporate media and decided to start my own blog at the time. I named it Mint Press, and within a year of working there, I was able to raise funds and get the support of family members and friends and people within my network, and build an online news website and expand it. And that's what Mint Press News is today. And one of our main highlights is to tackle war narratives, to be able to dissect them and explain to the general public, you know, why these wars happen, which is, of course, to profit and to have control over resources and control over regional politics as well. And so one of the first stories we actually broke was a story on the war in Syria. And so when President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry said that Assad, you know, if he crosses this red line of using chemical weapons, we're going to invade. And of course, we all know that, you know, when countries get accused of using chemical weapons, that's just a pretext for an outright invasion of that country. And so when we investigated that story, we had journalists on the ground in Syria to look at who had committed the 2013 chemical weapons attack. The media in the United States, the Western media, they were lockheed in step with with U.S. politicians and President Obama, and that Assad had committed this chemical weapons attack. And so we had reporters on the ground to investigate, and they interviewed locals who had come back to us and said that it was rebels with al-Nusra Front, who the United States at the time were arming by proxy because they were armed by Saudi Arabia. So we published a story, it immediately went viral. And I mean, viral to the point where we were getting over 100,000 unique visitors to our website every couple of minutes. I mean, it completely crashed our site and our hosting services. We had to actually host the article on other websites. And so that excitement was short-lived because immediately after, I had become the victim of a smear campaign. Our journalists that were on the story were intimidated to retract the article, to retract the coverage that they had gone through. And so this was, again, another experience that we had, and what does it take to challenge the mainstream narratives of war? They, who are the establishment, want to ensure that these narratives are hidden, that they're censored. And so I found myself within a couple of weeks at the front page of one of the top 10 websites in the world, BuzzFeed, next to President Assad, actually, and being accused of being a supporter and financed by the Assad government themselves, so that the story could be dismissed and the highlight of the coverage would now become about myself. And it was just a traditional smear campaign. And so this was our first experience in what it takes to challenge war narratives. And at the time, during this smear campaign, we lost a lot of allies and a lot of friends because they were more worried about their image and their reputation. But in the process, Mint Press gained a lot of readers and a lot of respect, and we gained a lot of new allies in the process. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that you, during the panel, take from all of this is never be afraid to stand up for what's right, no matter how lonely or how alone you end up being. We have to be able to, we have to be willing to take the risk of losing some friends, even family, even people in the industry, because sometimes speaking the truth means that you have to speak it alone.